I've got 6 questions here. I reckon I might get you 2.
Yes.
In about the next 40 minutes. And secondly, though, we are taking questions from the floor.
Yep.
So I want you to really think about what you might be able to ask Rory. Now, question number 1 is, why do you think there might be a number of marketing directors between roles right now?
I mean, the longevity has increased, I think, hasn't it, in recent years? There was this effectively sort of doom prophecy about 5 or 6 years ago where the average kind of tenure of a marketing director was becoming absurdly small. I hope one of the reasons why the longevity is increasing is that in organizations, marketing is fighting its way out of what I call the Marcom's ghetto, okay? And very interestingly, the late Jeremy Bullmore, who some of you will remember, I only once saw him get really, really angry, which is when anybody used the word Marcoms. And the conflation of marketing with communications, I think, has been catastrophic for the whole discipline. And actually, being absolutely candid, you know, work coming from an agency, it was probably in agencies' own interests to perpetuate that kind of dangerous assumption. But if you can actually claw your way out of purely being what I call, there's a huge danger. Okay, I'll go back a bit, there we are, so I can digress. When I first came into the advertising industry in the late 80s, 2/3 of ad spend was packaged goods. Actually, it was slightly more than 2/3. It's now around 22%. Now, what's different about that is in the packaged goods companies, marketing was a board level discipline. It was inordinately expensive as a huge part of their expenditure, taken massively seriously, okay? Yeah. And marketing was therefore effectively an influential discipline, which actually had a bearing on all of the activities of a business. What changed over what is now 35 years I've been in the business is, as I said, that 66% that was packaged goods is now down to 20. And the slack has been taken up typically by all sorts of new businesses, from insurance comparison websites to cable TV providers to broadband providers to mobile phone networks, which don't have a marketing culture, they have an engineering culture or a financial culture. And bluntly put, the danger within those organizations, when you have either a finance-driven culture or an engineering-driven culture, is that marketing becomes treated as reprographics with a degree. In other words, it's seen entirely as a service function, and that it's endlessly, its only role is to continually struggle to justify its own existence. And I think this was actually made worse and exacerbated by the fact that the tech companies, and to some extent, I think a lot of marketers played along with this because it sounded so appealing, sold people on a completely unrealizable vision of complete quantification. You know, that every single penny you spent could be justifiable and measured. And what started as actually, bear in mind my whole background is direct marketing, okay? I still consider myself a direct marketer. I love measurement, testing, randomized control trials. But there was a healthy form of that, which is, that's good in the digital world, we can now measure and test more things than we could before. And we may learn interesting things, which is an entirely healthy approach, to a weird kind of reversal of that, which is, unless you can measure it, you can't do it at all. Okay? And by the way, that was always the slight curse of working in direct marketing. If you had a good idea which wasn't directly measurable, you were never allowed to do it. Yeah. Okay? And I think that if there's a kind of healthy reversal of these trends where one, marketing is basically has ended up painted into a corner by 2 things, one of which is the assumption that it's effectively a comms service function to the rest of the organization, rather than being a fundamentally different way of looking at a business. What Mark Ritson calls, you know, the 180-degree flip, where you look at a business through the eyes of the customer, not through the eyes of the organization. That's what it fundamentally is. I mean, he's fundamentally right about that. If we don't actually recover that and make the point that effectively, if you don't have a marketer on a board, you will literally end up with a board of directors where the customer interest is represented by nobody at all. Yeah. Okay, that's a terrifying state of affairs. And by the way, how many of you have been on a board? It's actually terrifying being a marketer on a board, because brilliantly, Jules Goddard, a professor at London Business School, very good guy, some of you may know him, he always said that if you look at a balance sheet, it has 6 cost lines and 1 revenue line, and in a board meeting, the discussion proceeds in exactly that ratio. Okay, so operational efficiency and cost reduction does receive 6/7 of the attention. And then companies go, this is strange, we're not growing. Okay. And actually you feel on a board, and I've had the experience as being a non-executive director once or twice, that everybody basically is saying, you know, this thing isn't selling and we're going to reduce the price. And you want to say, why don't you double the price and paint it pink? Yeah. But you realize that to say something like that is completely embarrassing and inappropriate, because a whole board meeting proceeds on the basis that business, under the pretense that business is deterministic, not probabilistic. And actually, I think we should actually get back to just the honest acceptance that a lot of marketing, my friend Nassim Taleb, of those of you who are fans of the Black Swan, Nassim Taleb says, look, marketing is fat-tailed. What you're actually doing is trying to get really, really lucky, you know, like 12% of the time. It's a casino, but it's a casino overall with really good odds. You know, not many people actually leave the marketing casino worse off than when they went in. But because this requirement for kind of the pretense of determinism, the pretense that business operates through a kind of Newtonian physics, yeah. I think we should get back to just being completely honest about that. Instead of pretending that marketing can be just as quantifiable as, you know, something like logistics, okay? We should just accept the fact that, look, part of the point of marketing is it's an attempt to get lucky, okay? That actually, effectively, what you are doing through marketing is you're increasing your... The very brilliant guy who runs an agency called Mischief in New York, I don't know if anybody knows him, he just describes basically fame is a luck multiplier. The more people know about you, the more surface area exposure you have to positive upside optionality. That's the way Nassim puts it, okay? And I think we should just be honest about this. Like, we should be honest about the fact that there's a degree of risk and reward. There's, you know, effectively, that we shouldn't try this pretense of certainty anymore. And so I'm hopeful that if there's a growing acceptance of this, then that's part of the reason why the longevity of marketing directors is increasing. But we have, I mean, one thing I will say, which is obviously massively self-interested, is that if you adopt a behavioural approach and you discuss, I'll be absolutely honest with you, okay? Yeah. I think the word brand is actually hugely important, but also fundamentally unhelpful. One, because it's a bit like the blank tile in Scrabble, which is you can use it to mean anything you want it to mean in any given sentence. And secondly, because generally people like finance people either find the word scary or immediately assume it's not their responsibility, because that's a marketing problem. If you start talking about behavioural change, one of which is you can actually predict the value of a change in behaviour. But secondly, one of the things I notice about this is that you can have conversations with people in finance, people in CEOs, people in operations about behaviour, which somehow gel and take root. And we had one fantastic success recently, okay, which is a client of ours, fantastic woman called Polly Jones, who's the marketing director of Odeon. And partly, when she first arrived, she'd go to the board with various sort of behavioural suggestions, one of which being that you have standard seats in the cinema and you have premium seats. Okay, if you want more people to order the premium seats, you should create super premium seats, because now the premium seats are the one in the middle, which is disproportionately popular because of something called the Goldilocks effect. Okay, and then it so turned out that the only place they could put super premium seats was actually by creating massive cabana-style day beds right in the front of the cinema in real estate which was previously completely unused. So not only do they have far more people booking premium seats, but they had a completely new source of revenue from a part of the cinema which was previously considered a dead zone. Okay? And then various experiments later, for example, multiplying the number of people who pre-order food by a factor of 27, okay? By tweaking the context in which the message is sent. This kind of stuff. Now, what's fantastic is you only need 3 or 4 of those, and now suddenly everybody on the board wants to talk to you. So she actually describes it as going from being a slightly comedic figure on day one to being someone who's effectively consulted on, you know, broader questions now. And genuinely, I think 50% of the value of behavioral science, behavioral economics, is the ability to talk marketing to people who aren't marketers. So that's my sort of, if you like, that's my, you know, we almost discovered this accidentally. So I wrote this goddamn book. I'm weirdly on Tik Tok for no readily apparent reason, okay? And I suddenly realized if you change the language away from our specialist argot, the market and the appetite for what we do is actually 10 times bigger than we ever thought it was. That's the bit that interests me. Sorry, yeah, you go back. Yeah.
So you talked about get lucky.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, I mean that, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in the room who want to get lucky. And I'd love to know, if you were an in-betweener at the moment, where would you go to get lucky in your next marketing job?
Okay, I'd probably spend a bit of time looking for really, really interesting tech firms or startups. By the way, I'd also consider going plural. I wouldn't rule it out. Let me explain something which I don't think anybody's noticed adequately. Some of you may have come across an American startup which came out of Ogilvy, a guy which is called The Intangibles. I don't know if anybody's heard about them. There's a feature on them somewhere. And I was talking to Ben, who founded that the other day. I said, what nobody's bloody noticed, everybody's talking about AI, okay? But in terms of behavior and opportunity, the most important technology of the last 5 years is ironically Zoom and Teams, okay? Not because it's new technology, but because it's an old technology that's newly normalized and widely used. You know, in 2019, you could actually suggest a video call with a client, but it made you look like a weirdo, okay? I will confess this, I'm not making this up. I met the marketing director of Zoom in August 2019, and we were discussing ways in which you could possibly get wider adoption of video conferencing. And I actually said, just as he was leaving, I said, the suggestion we made was, look, make Friday Zoom day, okay? So effectively, it's a coordination problem. If you create a big idea of thank Zoom, it's Friday, so that Friday becomes the day you stay at home and do Zoom calls, you've solved a coordination problem. And then just as I finished that, she was leaving, I said, of course, what you really need is a major transport strike or a small pandemic. And so anyway, we put her in touch with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because we're a full-service agency, of course. But it's actually really important, because one of the things it does is it creates a spot market in talent. You know, you couldn't actually be available for an hour to give some really valuable advice and then move on. You'd have to have some sort of much wider commitment. And I think the value of really good people in actually, there are an awful lot of people, myself included, you wouldn't want to employ me for a fucking week. You're a pain in the arse, okay? I'm quite valuable for a good half hour. Okay, if you just want someone to come along and dick with your conventional thinking, half an hour of me is probably enough, if I'm being absolutely honest, okay? And so I think there's an awful lot of marketing talent which would be really, really well deployed in short bursts. So I wouldn't rule that out, but I'd also go and see if you can find a really interesting startup, because I think that a lot of very, very good ideas actually fail not because they're not good ideas, but because no one works out how to market them. I always say in economic terms, there are two ways you can create value in the marketplace, okay? You can find out what people want and work out a really clever way to make it, or you can work out what you can make and find out a clever way to make people want it. And actually the value is exactly the same, regardless of the direction of travel of those two things. And so I think they're an awful, you know, we could go back and, you know, what are the worst branded ideas in the history of the world? Nuclear power, never a good idea, okay, to brand something after a weapon. You know, it's probably not a good idea. But I mean, there are literally cases, you know, range anxiety, okay? You know, totally ludicrous, but you know, that literal bollocks about range anxiety. I mean, in America, fair enough, right? We live in the UK. If you drive 200 miles in a straight line, you end up in the fucking sea, right? I mean, you know, seriously, right? So, you know, actually, a great product badly marketed is the saddest thing in the world, because it's, you know, falling at the last hurdle is the worst thing you can do. And so I suspect there are quite a lot of opportunities. You could go and look around and find something where you go, actually, this is much more brilliant than you realize. And By the way, they'll probably ignore you, but it's worth a try. My great one, by the way, which by the way, just to be clear, there are a lot of fucking things I've been wrong about, and there are an awful lot of bits of advice I've given which I really, really regret, just to be clear. But there was one thing that always annoys me, which is about 14 years ago, both my boss and I went to Philips and said, you're sitting on a fucking gold mine with this air fryer thing, you really ought to advertise it, okay? And they looked at us as if we were insane, okay? So one of the things I would look at doing is literally actually approaching someone spontaneously with a useful idea as to what they could be doing. Because typically in startups, the marketing person is the last person to be appointed. And that strikes me as a fundamental mistake, actually, because until you've got an idea about how to sell something, you haven't got an innovation, you've just got an invention.
So I've got a question with you about LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So we're going to do a little straw poll here. How many people in the room are on LinkedIn? How many of the people in the room have successfully applied for a job and received a job through LinkedIn? Oh my God, one person. Really? This is the first time it's ever happened. Carmen, what was the role?
I was a marketing director at an aggregator.
A marketing director and an aggregator.
Yeah. I didn't enjoy it, I just stayed for 6 months.
Thank God. So one person got a job through LinkedIn and you hated it.
That's true.
Oh, sorry. At the back. Was it? Clara, don't let me down. Doesn't help my story.
Sometimes, of course, if you're actually in a job, LinkedIn actually becomes like a confederacy of the needy, doesn't it? A little bit. You know, everybody there basically wants something from you, you know, a favour of some kind. But at the same time, I mean, it's hugely valuable in not losing touch. I mean, apart from anything else, it started as effectively a live directory service. And it was, before LinkedIn existed, it was incredibly difficult. Remember, it predated Facebook by a long time. It was incredibly difficult just to lose contact with people completely. Okay? And so it is valuable in the sense that remember, there's getting a job, and there's also the person who remembers you, who needs a memory jogger as to how to get hold of you, how to reach you, etc. So undoubtedly, you know, we shouldn't be totally dismissive of this. My great-grandfather was running a shop in in Gilwan, I think, in the 1910s, completely unaware that his cousin was President of the United States. Okay? So, you know, we forget the fact that before this technology existed, you could completely lose contact with people in perpetuity and never find them again. So, you know, there is a huge value to that, and actually, I'm sure there's also a lot of advice that happens over LinkedIn. In other words, a lot of the background activity is going to be happening there. What seems to be the case, though, looking at the sort of people who study network theory, is that, strangely, most people seem to find jobs through weak second-order connections, not through first-order connections. And they're not quite sure why this is. But it seems to be that sort of actually a disproportionate, not only because there are more of them, which there obviously are, but a disproportionate number of kind of useful referrals seem to happen at the sort of periphery of people's social networks rather than in the middle. Which, I mean, whatever the reason for that might be, I genuinely don't know. But it is an interesting fact. So that's a justification for events exactly like this.
So
yeah.
Heardify, who have all your drinks this evening. To be honest, what I do like about Heardify a lot is they work in herds, and so that's what we're doing this evening with communities. So we talked about LinkedIn, which is more digital, as most people know. I don't leave home without a business card. It's one thing, because I believe in like face-to-face and always going out, just meeting people the whole time. The communities like this, I mean, real communities, you talked about second order connections. If you were an in-betweener, how valuable are communities?
Oh, I mean, one huge thing, because when I did the IPA job, it was very amusing because you spend your whole time working for a single advertising agency, and then you work for effectively a trade organisation, and you suddenly realise actually it's the same shit for everybody. Okay, you know, you're absolutely obsessed up to that point that your problems are completely individual and specific to you, and then you pretty much realise that actually it's the same crap for everybody. Now, by the way, I will make a point which I think is really important, which is being in between, i.e. waiting long enough to find the right next job, is a perfectly honourable state. Okay, we're never allowed to say that for some reason, but actually a certain amount of time spent looking and effectively broadening your range of possibilities is a totally sensible thing to do. It's the same thing goes, by the way, you know, I had a friend who said you could never say it politically, but that actually a degree of youth unemployment is a good thing, because you don't want people just going into the first job they find available and being stuck with it. That actually a certain amount of time with the freedom to actually explore and discover what you're good at is really, really useful. I think there's an interesting thing I think we should look at, which is, and I think we need to make this point much better as general marketing people, which is that an awful lot of business decision making now is oriented around winning arguments, okay? Yes. And the marketing mindset is fundamentally different in that the kind of mindset you want to solve a problem is not the same mindset as the kind of mindset you want to win an argument. And most business now, the decisions go to the person with the best argument, not the person with the best solution. For example, I think there's a lot of bogus use of cherry-picked data, effectively, to create an apparent rational case for doing something which actually to the consumer isn't very interesting. Okay, I think there's an awful lot of benchmarking bollocks that goes on, which is basically a McKinseyite effort to make your company more and more like your competitors, which seems a completely, you know, ridiculous thing to do. And the one thing I would like marketers to do is actually to be generally more aggressive and more confident, because generally we're at a disadvantage in a world where you in a world where you need to win arguments, because we have fewer hard facts. You know, what we deal with is, as I said, you know, to some extent probabilistic. But actually, if you want to solve a problem, you actually want marketing skill. And actually, the reason we're unpopular is precisely because in argumentation world, you want to be the person who claims the one right way of doing something, okay, which is typically best practice singular, okay. Weirdly, the very strength of marketing, which is because of the vagaries of human psychology, we can find 7 ways of solving a problem, okay, weirdly makes us unpopular. So the very fact that actually, if you want to win an argument, what you want to do is narrow the solution set down to one single point. Okay? If you want to solve a problem, you want the solution set to be big. In the kind of environment in which self-justification prevails and where effectively arguments are constructed as a form of defensive mechanism, you know, in other words, I had a good rational reason for doing this, therefore I can't be blamed if it turns out badly. I think in that environment, marketers are at a disadvantage. I think we actually ought to actually criticise the excessive attempts at sort of rationalisation in business decision making. I actually think it looks like a virtue, it looks rigorous, it looks intelligent. It's actually pretty stupid. Okay. And I always ask that question. It's one of the things I did in my talk, which is, okay, let's imagine if you'd given the brief for High Speed 2, not to a load of engineers, right? You give them the brief to Disney, right? The first thing they would have done is said, your brief is bollocks. It's all about capacity, speed, you know, cost, you know, journey time, etc. Okay, it's the wrong question. The real question you should be asking is, how do you make the train journey from London to Manchester so enjoyable, people feel stupid going by car? That's the right question. Now, why does nobody ask that question instead of the nerdy engineering question? Precisely because it actually has multiple answers which require both creativity and some subjective judgment. But there are lots of answers to that question. That's a good thing, right? But to people who want to win an argument, lots of answers is a bad thing. And so you literally have the case where the need to be rational is causing people to shy away from creative solutions because it then involves ambiguity or subjectivity in the performance of your job. And to some extent, someone's got to kick back against this because it genuinely is. I mean, to be honest, no one gives a shit. Okay, no passenger gives a shit whether the journey to Manchester takes 1 hour 10 or 1 hour 28. Not a single person will ever be influenced in their decision. You know, oh, I would go to Manchester today, but it takes 7 minutes too long. I mean, fuck off. You know, okay. It's just, you know, and so a lot of business activity is becoming completely detached from the interests of the customer or the consumer in the pursuit of metrics that are just assumed to be relevant. And actually, you know, they've often, in many cases, become completely detached from what a customer actually cares about. I might carry on.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then you're going to ask some questions on the floor. But I want to see
please.
Tricks if I can. So, Rory, you've become the accidental star of TikTok.
Yeah.
So here's a question for most people in the room. So, how many of you have a TikTok account? Okay, so I'm going to say that's almost all of the room. How many of you are regularly posting on TikTok? That's no one in the room. Okay? One person? Rory?
Yeah.
Rory works for Elton John. Okay, so...
Oh, right.
Yeah, exactly. So there we go. But what advice would you have for marketing directors? Should they be on TikTok? Should they be posting? How could they be as interesting and famous as you on TikTok from a metric level?
Well, the weirdest thing is that I think something like 30 to 40% of new Mad Masters intake comes via TikTok, which, given that it's largely, well, to an extent, a B2B product, is kind of weird. But actually, I think the tendency we have to stereotype media, you know, to create what you might call false distinctions and false dichotomies between different media. I mean, I have to say this, okay? Basically, whenever I talk to a tech company, okay, I go in and I go, well, if all else fails, I'll just tell them to use physical direct mail. Okay, because it works incredibly well. One of our clients described their direct mail as annoyingly effective. They said, okay, and it's annoyingly effective because they get a whole load of grief in a digital company for sending out physical mail, even though it works really well. So there are an awful lot of there's an awful lot of cultural stereotyping, which I think goes on around media. And TikTok would absolutely back me up on this because they make the point that their actual, you know, the stereotypical audience is nothing like the real audience. And you know, that's often the case. They're also, by the way, just a huge value to indiscriminate fame. We, you know, with our obsession with micro-targeting and minimizing wastage, we forget the fact that just, you know, as I said, you know, being famous is a luck multiplier. Mm-hmm. Apart from anything else, you discover customers that you didn't. In other words, by actually going out widely, you discover whole sources of business that you never would have predicted yourself. So when you're famous, people come to you whose existence you're unaware of with propositions. When you're obscure, you have to find all your customers yourself, okay? And often you're wrong about it, okay? There's nothing more efficient than being famous and allowing your customers to come and find you, okay? That's actually the most efficient form of marketing in one respect. So no, I mean, I think that, I mean, weirdly, I never intended, but with no part of my intention, it was pure fluke. There was a young, very talented film student who, Hugo, who during COVID, I did a lot of podcasts because there wasn't much else to do. And Hugo just started taking snippets from my podcast and effectively TikTokizing them. And the first I knew about this was, well, actually, first when my children complained, basically said, you're a fat 59-year-old man, what the fuck are you doing on TikTok? And the next thing I realized something was going on was when I started getting mobbed by kids in the street, okay? But it was never intentional. But there is something interesting, which is the very fact that it just doesn't make sense is a reason to do it, okay? Now this is, I think, the difference between how marketers think, by the way, and how conventionally rational people think. I love this story because I think it's brilliant. There's a book, anybody read Will Guidara's book, Unreasonable Hospitality? Ah, right. If you've got any kind of business with a customer service angle in it, any kind of, you know, call center, whatever. I know it's a book by a guy who ran a Michelin 3-star restaurant, but it's actually, Jeremy Bullmore, who said the best books about advertising aren't about advertising. And this is a case in point. And I love this story because I think it's great. So he's a 3-star Michelin, the guy, he's running the restaurant, and in the San Pellegrino Annual Restaurant Awards, they come number 50 out of 50, out of the top 50 restaurants in the world. And between 2010 and 2017, he sets out to get to number 1. And one of the first things he does is he takes a cross-section of his staff from the kitchen, from front of house, from wait staff, etc., and he takes them to the number 1 restaurant in the world, which conveniently happens to be in Manhattan as well. And they all sit there, they go to this best restaurant in the world where they've managed to secure a table, and they start taking notes about what's really brilliant. And everybody goes, oh, this is brilliant, I love what they've done with the floral arrangements, look, we could copy that thing we've done with the wine glasses. And at the end of the evening, everybody's done that thing, which is benchmarking. In other words, judging yourself against the best there is. And brilliantly, because he's got the mind of a game theorist, Will Guidara does something which I call reverse benchmarking. He said, I'm not interested in any of that shit, because all we'd be doing is copying them. What I want to know is, out of the whole evening, what was a bit shit, okay? They well, nothing, they finally, now, it actually requires a bit of imagination, because often what's shit about something, particularly at that level, isn't that they're shit at something, it's just that something's missing. In other words, so you actually require a bit of creativity. There's a bit of dog that doesn't bark in the night you've got to look for. And they came up with 2 things that they thought, when they thought about it, that were a bit shit. There was nothing special about the coffee. It was no better than a random coffee, after-dinner coffee experience. And particularly, I think, among the people who are chefs, quite a few of them had asked to drink beer, and the beer drinkers were treated really, really badly compared to the wine drinkers, which anybody who's a beer drinker, including the fine lady over there from Magnus, and will recognise that completely. If you're in a fancy restaurant, it's like, yeah, we've got this in bottles, we've got that in draft. Whereas the wine drinkers are treated to this whole panoply of bollocks about terroir, and it's basically, wine marketing is basically a way of turning inconsistency into a virtue, in my book. I think it's bollocks, to be honest. But okay, no, we've got this fantastically inconsistent product, okay? Every year it's different. Isn't that brilliant? No, get it fucking right the first time. Anyway, sorry about that. Okay, but what happened is the beer drinkers said about. So he goes back to his restaurant and he appoints one guy from, I think he's a waiter, who's a coffee nut. He says, you're the coffee sommelier from now on. And the other guy from the kitchen, who's a kind of craft IPA nut, basically becomes the beer sommelier. So if you actually go to that restaurant and said, what have you got in the way of beer? And you're expecting, we got this in bottles, we got Sam Adams on draft, okay? Someone comes to you with a beer menu and suggests food pairings and talks about the different beers that might go particularly well with different dishes. And as a beer drinker, you're going, fucking hell, right? Okay, this has never happened before. Now that's what I call reverse benchmarking. Don't copy the best things that your competitors do. Find out what your competitors are shit at and do it really, really well. Now, you could argue that's basically what Apple did, okay? Which is loads and loads of people were competing on the basis of technological superiority, and Apple basically said, we'll produce a product that's actually slightly behind the curve technologically, but unlike everybody else, we'll make it look really good. So that you can actually have a computer in your home without turning any, you'll remember this from the 80s and 90s, right? If you put a computer in a room at your home, it basically turned it into an office, didn't it? Okay, it was beige. I mean, you might as well install 3 filing cabinets and a fucking photocopier by the time you put a computer anywhere in your home. And I think that's a fundamental way in which marketing thinking should really differentiate itself from conventional business thinking, which is actually don't try and be as good as your competitors at the things they're good at. Actually, find out where the weak spot is and basically double down on making that brilliant. And fundamentally, that will then create differentiation. It'll create extra profits for the business because it's adequately differentiated. It will massively increase the overall value of the category in which you operate because there's more choice within it, and it benefits consumers because they've got more things to choose from. Whereas benchmarking is basically like effectively a lot of people walking into a corner together. It's a kind of effectively a kind of race to the bottom. So I think fundamentally we just have to accept the fact that, look, marketers think in a different way. It's a complementary way to everybody else. Given that it's closer to how your customers think than anybody else, you kind of have to take it seriously. Now, shut up with the spreadsheets for a minute.
Great.
Okay, that's basically it. So questions, sorry, yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
We're going to do off the back, so.
If you were going for a role you saw on LinkedIn that you were like, this is me, what one thing would you do to get yourself an interview?
Tell them something they're wrong about. Actually, I mean, I genuinely think, I mean, one of the things that annoys me about agency world is it's a bit diffident sometimes, okay? And actually, occasionally, so, did you say you worked at Rightmove?
I did.
Yeah, I think that the choice architecture for property websites is a complete disaster, okay? Now, just to give you an example of how fucked up it is, just for interest, okay? You can't sell a house for £825,000. The reason is everybody either starts 800,000 and up or 850,000 and down, okay? Because of the terms of the filtration system of the website. So if you're in between two of those points, okay, either you're too expensive for the people searching upwards or you're too cheap for the people searching downwards, or they won't even find you at all, okay? There are a whole load of flaws which assume the whole of property search website system is based on the assumption that people know what they want to begin with, okay? Also true of dating sites, by the way. What you'll find in dating and property, and if you talk to an estate agent, is every single person comes to an estate agent with a list of criteria, and every single one of those people buys a house that meets none or very few of those initial criteria, because you use the process of searching to refine your preferences, okay? So I would take your Rightmove experience, go and find a really innovative business like ostrich.co.uk, and go and offer to tell them what you know. Does anybody know what Ostrich is? It's very small at the moment.
I do, because I've had the direct mail.
You've had their direct mail, you see? Okay, right. Okay, maybe they're listening. Because Ostrich is a way in which you can make your house open to offers without actually putting it on the market. Okay, and that was this really, so I'm fascinated by the whole category, sorry, this was an extraordinary experiment which I've tried everyone. Okay, how many people here have their house on the market currently? You're mostly over 40, so you actually do have a house. Yeah, okay, how many people would sell your house and move if you received a pretty attractive offer out of the blue? Okay, every single time I've tried this experiment, the ratio is 4 to 1. I've tried it in Ireland, I've tried it in Canada. Obviously it doesn't work with people under 40, because they go, what's a house? Okay, right, okay, sorry, okay, right. But, now, what that suggests is there are 4 times as many people who'd be prepared to sell their house as there are people who put their house on the market. Now, that's a really interesting finding in the property market, because it suggests that there are a load of people who, now, okay, if we think about it by analogy with dating, okay, it's kind of obvious. There's a difference between chatting someone up and being chatted up, right? You know, if Jessica Chastain or George Clooney, you probably wouldn't go and chat them up. But if they chatted you up, you might rethink your living arrangements. Okay, right? Okay, right? Now, the point I'm making there was we all understand instinctively when it comes to dating that there's kind of a difference between the two, okay? And one of them, of course, is possibly fear of rejection, very obviously, okay? Once someone's interested in you, there's no fear of rejection, all right? And whereas having a load of people coming around your house and basically sniffing at it, okay, is just, it's a really unpleasant thing. It's just a really unpleasant. Maybe people just hate estate agents more than they hate moving a house. There could be loads of explanations, but it's a really interesting finding, this ratio of 4 to 1. And so I go to someone like Ostrich and say, I know all the secrets of Rightmove. Let's go and talk. Because they've actually adopted it's rather like those experiments in dating sites where various people were trying different choice architectures. I think the whole online dating thing is pretty, I mean, I got married in way before there was an internet, which means I feel like basically I caught the last helicopter out of Saigon as far as finding a partner goes. But I think there might be something really, I think there could be something really, really interesting in the property, in basically property finding, which could be absolutely huge. So I'd go and explore that, definitely.
So,
yeah.
Tom, you had a question in front of you.
So, Tom Newman Young, currently British Airways, but...
Oh, wow. Okay, right, British Airways.
You're in a job.
Please. Okay, I'm going to say this again because I've been saying it for half of the day. Why the fuck don't you have a gift currency? Okay, you can't. I can go into WH Smith's, I can buy Amazon vouchers, Netflix vouchers, Apple vouchers. You can't buy British Airways vouchers and give them as a present. It's fucking insane. I've been saying this to you for anyway. I'll leave it at that. There you go. Okay, but seriously, the leakage will make you a fortune, and a load of people will use it to upgrade. So I've always thought that you can't buy as a wedding present a few £100 of British Airways vouchers. Who wouldn't do that? Okay, there we go. Sorry.
My question comes back to you're talking about benchmarks and being a sort of great race to the bottom. Do you think AI is actually moment to shine?
Do you know what I think will happen with AI? Because I think it always happens with tech, and this is my kind of weird prediction, okay? What always happens with tech is loads and loads of nerdy people who want to impress other nerdy people compete like crazy for technological superiority, okay? And then someone else comes along with a cute user interface and makes all the money. And it strikes me as really weird with AI, the extraordinary billions that seem to be poured into making it a bit better at what it already does, versus asking the question, how can we make this really useful? And the only point I make about it is really impressive, it's patently really interesting, okay? And I look at most of these AI models and go, this is extraordinary, I'm really fascinated. But I'm not the fucking Emperor Augustus. Never in the last 30 years have I ever sat down and thought, what I really want is a scribe, right? Okay? There are loads of things that would make my life a lot easier, like, you know, a really helpful mate who might chat things through with you. But I find there's something weird about it, and it's a bit like the very early days of search where you had Yahoo, you know what I mean, before Google came along, which was fundamentally an important function that was being delivered in completely the wrong packaging. That's the only thing that really interests me about it, which is I'm not sure that, in other words, I think it's one of those technologies that has been very much driven by the urge of people to impress other people like them. And I think what it actually needs is a few marketing people to actually ask some tough questions about them, which is, you know, how are you going to, I mean, if you think about it, an AI travel agent could be really, really interesting. But it wouldn't be instantaneous, you see. You might, so one of the assumptions is that everything has to be instantaneous in tech world. But actually, if I'm planning a holiday or a trip, I want a slow AI where I can say, I'm kind of interested in going to Greece in 2026. Can you send me interesting shit every couple of days over the next few months? And it's rather like, you know, both dating and a estate agency. It's not a decision we want to take instantaneously. And so there's something about that where I think, you know, someone needs to ask the question, how do humans really make decisions about things? And is there a way we can reflect that better in the way we're delivering this?
Nice. Another question from the floor?
Rory, I've done Mad Masters, absolutely brilliant. One overriding message that I've taken is the fact that we need to change our language.
Yeah.
If you were on LinkedIn, how would you change your language to move away from being marketing but deliver value that makes the impact?
I've got a brilliant answer to that, which isn't me. It's a fantastic copywriter colleague I had called Alistair Graham, who some of you may know. And he always said something brilliant, which resonated with me. And I'll tell you why it particularly resonated, okay? He said, the language of marketing is like the language of astrology, which is, if you're talking to fellow believers, it's absolutely fine. But if you're talking to anybody else, you sound batshit crazy. And the reason this particularly resonates with me is my brother's actually an astronomer, okay? And the worst thing that happens if you're an astronomer is you go to a party and you say you're an astronomer and the person says, I'm a Sagittarius. And you go, oh, fuck, right, okay, right. And so it is, I think that comment of Alistair Graham's, which is that the language to us makes perfect sense, brand iconography or whatever. If you're talking to someone in finance, okay, it's way off the scale in terms of abstraction. And that's why I quite like bringing it back to behaviour. The other great thing with behaviour is you can put a cash value on it. You can't really put a cash value on attitudinal change without quite a lot of complexity. But actually asking the question, how do we get people to do X instead of Y, is actually a game everyone can play. And I totally agree with that. I think actually, I mean, it happens in every business to an extent, okay, where you develop your own weird phraseology. But probably, if you think about it, given that we're in sort of business of communication and understanding human perception. We should be less guilty of it than most disciplines rather than more. But I always thought that observation, it's like astrology. If you're talking to a fellow believer, absolutely fine. But to anybody who's overhearing you, they go, oh, shit, right? And I think that's probably fair. And actually, great thing. I mean, let's be absolutely honest about it, okay? Behavioral economics is psychology, okay? That's all it is. I mean, Daniel Kahneman, I don't think ever called himself a behavioural economist. It was people like Richard Thaler, who were in an economics faculty, who coined this thing. But it was a complete gift, because once you put economics in the title of something, people in finance have to take it seriously. And someone made a brilliant point, which is, they said the weird thing is, the President of the United States can have, and in fact does have, a Council of Economic Advisors. You can't have a council of psychological advisors because it sounds like weirdly sinister, okay? And so, yeah, all it was basically a fantastic accidental rebranding of psychology in terms that meant people had to take it seriously.
There we go.
That's fine.
Yeah, it's a lovely story I heard from Rory last week that I wanted to say to you all. It's a nice little life hack. If any of you ever want to give anyone a present and you don't think you actually know what to give them, buy them an Amazon gift voucher, but take a photo of the code on the voucher, give it to them, then wait 3 months and check if they've actually cashed the voucher in. If they haven't, use it for yourself and buy something for yourself off Amazon.
If you've got incompetent friends, that's the perfect present, right?
Some people in the room have already done Mad Masters. Hands up if you've already done it. Not enough. We need to get more of you on it. The last 3 years of 2022, and we interviewed every single person that had done it. And 96% of people said that it has made them more confident in carrying out their day-to-day tasks. So that's 96% of people from 10,000 people have already said that. So it's obviously glowing in feedback. And 94% of people have said that it's very easy to fit around their day-to-day schedule. So if you're an in-betweener, you can do it. If you're a person in a full-time job, you can fit it in. We're very, very flexible with how we want to make it work. What was the last one in November? I think it was like lawyers, police officers and doctors did the course, which was very, very random. Yeah, prison wardens as well, which is a very, very strange one because they want to understand the psychology behind why people do what they do. So that's Mad Masters as a whole. I'll hand you back over to Rich, but before I do, Rich has been an excellent host tonight, so can we all get a round of applause for Richard?
Giving a slight recap from Rory, some of the things he talked about were that you need to be more spontaneous, there is too much benchmarking bollocks out there, being famous is a luck multiplier, and when it comes to jobs, interestingly, weak second order connections are better for referrals. So think about the room that you're in at the moment and how that can work for you. But with that, thank you hugely to Rory Sutherland, and thank you all to each of you.